I am Aaron Blumberg, Swiftland's Continuing Education Coordinator, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Setting Up a Digital Reference Program, How to Serve Our Patrons Effectively. We have a wonderful learning opportunity ready for you this morning with Dr. Stephanie Rollins. Dr. Rollins is the Chief of Information Services at Muir S. Fairchild Research Information Center. She is also an adjunct digital reference professor for the University of Alabama. Stephanie serves on both regional and state library committees, and she has 21 years of experience in academic and special libraries. She holds a bachelor's in English from Auburn University, a master's in library service, and a doctorate in public administration, both from the University of Alabama. Please welcome Dr. Rollins and enjoy her webinar this morning. Dr. Rollins?
Thank you so much, Aaron. Can everybody hear me okay? Aaron, can you hear me okay?
And so can everyone
Okay.
else.
Okay, I just didn't see anything in the chat box. It might just be delayed on my end. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here, and thank you so much for understanding. I had a death in the family. My 93-year-old grandmother passed away, so we had her for a very long time, so that was um, just a really hard thing to go through, but I appreciate you guys understanding and rescheduling and being with me here today. What I want to talk to you today is about not so much the process of setting up a digital reference service, but focus more on how do we service our patrons effectively? How do we make that transition from, kind of being a person to more of a, one-on-one experience in an environment where we don't get to see the person? And what are some of the ways we can do that more effectively? So just a quick review of our agenda. This is what we're going to cover today. Slide seems to be delayed. Give me just 1 second. So just going from my memory because the slide doesn't. Okay, here we go. So just kind of a quick review of what we mean by digital reference. We'll talk about that. Some of the types of digital reference because everybody assumes that it's chat and it's not always the case. Some of the promises and challenges of digital reference. What does an effective digital reference transaction look like? I've got input from my students. What they say, is kind of the best chat. Kind of what I propose is kind of a digital reference cycle. Some of the skills that you need to be proficient at digital reference, and if you took the pre-class survey, great. If you didn't, that's okay. That's just something I did just for you guys to have and something you can look at as time goes by. I know when I taught my first digital reference class, I don't know that I had detailed functional knowledge of everything, although I was supposed to be the expert teaching it. And as have taught the class over the last 5 years, some of these areas I've definitely grown in, and that's because of the students and because of the interaction with the students. So it's just kind of a self-assessment to see where you are and where you need to practice. So if you didn't get to it, we're going to review kind of what those skills are. What constitutes an effective reference interview? We'll talk a little bit about scripting. I'm going to try to do a live demo of some resources. I'll talk about what I'm going to do before we go live in case there's kind of a drop off. But again, you'll have the recording, and I'll also have Aaron send you the links to every website that I go through. And to me, I know that you guys know how to search effectively. I know you know your resources. So to me, it's more of a focus on searching efficiently and how you can make that faster in a digital environment. And then to talk a little bit about evaluation, because the only way to me that, and I've stressed this with my students, the only way to get better is to practice and to evaluate yourself, whether that's through a transcripts, through a form, that kind of thing. And then I've got kind of a brief practice for you. If we don't get to it in time, it can be your hands-on homework, but we'll see how far we get with class today. So that's kind of just an outline of what I'd like to try to cover today. I'm so sorry, the slides seem to be really delayed.
They seem to be
Give me
delayed on
just one
your
second.
end. They're fine on ours.
Okay, so you have the next slide up already that says what is digital reference? Okay, give me just one second. I'm going to go get my printed. I always have a backup, so give me just one second. Sorry, everybody, I'll be right back. I'm back. Just very quickly. Sorry about that brief delay. So when we think about digital reference, some of the things we talk about are, people call it Ask a Librarian, Ask Us, e-reference, interactive reference, live online reference. A lot of places call it Ask Us to kind of take out the library vocabulary, make it more approachable for our users. So those are some of the things that people talk about when they think about digital reference. So some of the origins, hopefully that slide's come up for you. So how did it originate? Well, you may have remembered back in the day when we had, people use the phone a lot more. They didn't have text or cell phones back then. And they had these things called web call centers. In fact, in the early 90s, if you called Sears, you may have talked to me because I worked the web call center at Sears for the catalog. So, I guess my skills for reference started way back then, with live customer support. And some of the software that they use for this service is, can be described as chat software, instant messaging, call center management, interactive customer service. And today we kind of take it for granted. We see that there are, when we're using our AT&T or we're doing different shopping type interactions, you'll actually see the box pop up unasked for, do you need help? And the chat software is actually right there. Okay, so, oh, looks like it's picking back up. Fantastic. So some of the types of digital reference. Some people think digital reference is just chat. It's live, it's electronic, but there's also other types of digital reference. It's a little bit more delayed, but some people still use email and some people use forums. And again, it just depends on your library and what works for you and your patrons and their level of technology skills, your level of being able to support them. Maybe you're in a rural library and internet service is spotty, so an email might work better. The only problem with email, as we know, is that sometimes it's not so great for conducting the reference interview. That back and forth that we love so much with our patrons, it doesn't always work so well. Whereas the chat, although you don't have the person in front of you to see their body language, it can be a little bit better because you do have that back give and take, that back and forth. But sometimes people expect 24/7, and it's not necessarily 24/7. It's a lot of times when the library is open, that kind of thing. So that's a little bit about the types of digital reference, just to kind of review. But the great thing too about live real-time reference is it kind of addresses some of the limitations of the physical reference desk, because a lot of people experience frustration when they're trying to find things on the internet. They've Googled it, but they can't find what they want because they're not skilled searchers. And also sometimes people have a great deal of library anxiety when approaching the reference desk. So um, does everybody have the promise of digital reference slide up?
Yes.
Okay, okay. I saw Beth said she didn't have the slide up, so I'm just double checking to make sure everything's still okay. So some of the goals of digital reference, it's to our goal is always to meet our users where they're searching, whether they're in the library or they're online. Maybe it's within a database. Maybe they're inside EBSCOhost and they're struggling and they're having trouble. We want to meet our users where they are. And then we also want to keep pace with evolving expectations. Like my son and daughter-in-law, they don't call me very much anymore. They text. So their expectation is to be able to get online and talk to somebody without actually having to talk to them. And also, some of the statistics report that questions within libraries are declining. People like to use the web. Like I said, they like being able to search on their own time. And it's also, like I said, another good way to address the frustration and kind of that anxiety about the reference desk that some of our students and patrons have. It's a fantastic way to search distance learners if you're in a college library. Students who are many miles away can search the resources, but they can also talk to you. I remember when I was at Stanford and I was able to help um, a doctorate of nursing student walk through the databases through chat. So it's not that they were there with me, but they had a really good interaction with me, and I was able to help them. So it's not equal to being there in person on campus, but it just kind of helps level the playing field. And also peoples with disabilities. We're required by law to accommodate people with, wheelchair ramps and monitors with large type, screen reading software, different things like that. And if they have their own setup at home, they kind of also have, equal access to some of our resources. And then again, it's kind of a way of connecting with our with children, teenagers, college students, because a lot of them are really familiar and comfortable with this type of technology. Again, meeting our users where they are. And to me, one of my favorite things in it is that it highlights our skills. We're in a profession that is stereotyped and often not understood about what great things that we can do. And again, as this quote says, all the sources out there, especially library databases, not so much Google, but a lot of the library databases, they're becoming complex. And as this quote says, we need wise humans to help act as guides, and that's what we are. And so we are, um, you know, we're great. This article, you've got it in print, you've got it in writing. Librarians are completely awesome. The other thing that I love, I don't know if you've heard the story about, teach a man to fish. If you fish for the man, he's got fish, but if you teach him to fish, he's got fish for life. This is another way to highlight our skills so that we can include some instruction so they can also become more of a lifelong learner type situation. And it's also a way to build new relationships. If you chat with a faculty member and they have a successful experience, or any kind of patron, and you have a successful experience, they're going to, through word of mouth, promote your service, and that only highlights how valuable the library is. Should be anyways, but we're constantly having to reinforce that with our customers sometimes. So what are the challenges? I've told you all the great stuff about digital reference. So some of the challenges are, especially for our staff. Oops, sorry, I went too far. Okay. Slides seem to have a mind of their own today. They seem to be possessed. Sorry about that. So some of the challenges, for our staff, sometimes the technology, it can be intimidating and a high learning curve. Even if the chat software is simple, it's not so much maybe the software itself, but also the process of the reference interview, the scripting, how to do a chat, how to add it to our staff. Sometimes patrons don't understand what this service is. Again, like when you're on AT&T and that window pops up, you're like, oh, I don't need that, leave me alone. So they don't often understand what kind of service you're providing. So a lot of times, you really have to market the service to your patrons and get them to understand what a useful service this can be. As I said earlier, it provides that you must have great reference interview skills and not reference technical and communication skills, and not just at the reference desk. Transfer that to a virtual environment. Again, as I said earlier, sometimes it's hard to determine the tone the person has. If they're being sarcastic, I hope not. But if they're happy with the results that you found, because you don't have that body language or eye contact, you don't have their voice. Sometimes it's a time investment because a chat can take 2 to 3 times longer than it would in person. Also, you're doing this service, and does your boss support it? Does the administration support it? That can be a challenge. And like I said too, if you don't market it, and if people don't understand what it is, it can be underutilized. On the other hand, if you market it fantastically and it's a huge success, it can often overwhelm libraries that are with demand that are not fully staffed. That would be a great problem to have, I think. I haven't seen it yet. And then finally, some of the issues with accessibility. Does your service and the way that you're staffing it and the processes you use, does that intimidate people with disabilities? Does their software work? Those are all things that can be challenges for digital reference. Well, when I asked my students what they thought were the best types of digital reference, hopefully you can see this graphic. My slides seem to have slowed down again. But these are some of the things that they said, and I put it into a graphic here. And some of the things they said that constituted the best chats were the greeting, the listening. One of the things they said is don't just Google it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Allow for complex questions. Um, think about my question. Don't just, go to Google and find the first result and paste it in there. Um, courtesy, smile. Those are things that they were looking for. Follow up. Greet me, check in with me, don't leave me hanging. Those are all things that they said make some of the best chats. And that was from them after having been in the class a little bit. And those are things, they're librarians, and so those are things that they looked for in the effective chats. So when we talk about what I think is, hopefully you've got this graphic up, as effective digital reference, well, what would that be? And so when I think about effective digital reference, you have to know your skills, and we'll talk about that in detail. Assess your skills. What do you need to work on? Because your skills are key to having an effective chat transaction with your patron. And then also, you've got to be able to interview your patron. You have an effective reference interview with your patron. You've got to make the chat flow just like you would if you're having a conversation in person. And scripting can help with that, and we'll touch on that just a little bit. Picking the right resources, and you guys, that's your area of expertise. You guys know what resources to pick, but I'm going to give you a couple of strategies on that as well. And then searching effectively, but also efficiently, using your time wisely. And I'll show you kind of what I do as far as that goes, and see if that's something that helps you. And then you want to evaluate your skills. And all of this, of course, to me, that's the hugest part of this cycle is practice. You've got to practice. I mean, I've been doing this, been a librarian for 21 years. I've been chatting probably for half that time, and I've been teaching it for about 5 years. And I still feel like I need practice. So everybody can do with practice, and reevaluating your skills. So it just kind of is a cycle of getting better and better each time. So just to talk to you, hopefully this next screen will come up a little bit faster for you. So what skills are required to succeed? And it's kind of a three-part process, and you'll have seen this if you did the survey for yourself. But it's technical skills, of course. We've got that technology that we have to keep in mind, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. We've got communication skills. And then we've also got reference skills. And most people I find are really strong on the reference skills. In fact, my students are really great on the reference skills. But where they lack expertise, most of the time is on the communication skills, not the technical, because they're in the master's program, they have a lot of technology skills, but it's the communication skills, it's the flow of the chat, it's the making the person feel welcome, those types of things. But if you have great technical knowledge, communication skills, and reference skills, you can have an excellent chat interaction, and you can have what I call happy patrons. That's our goal, because happy patrons come back to you. Okay, so if you looked at the survey, and if you didn't, that's totally fine. Again, that's just something for you to come back to time after time to assess your skills. But what are some of the technical skills? And I know that some of these are pretty obvious. Of course, you want to know how to use a keyboard, mouse. Um, the other thing that I've told my students, you don't have to be an expert typist, but if you are a great typist, that will only help you. We'll talk about, how to work on some of these different skills if you aren't a great typist. I'll get to that in a minute. The other thing is you've got to be able to do multiple software at one time. Work between windows. What I'm going to show you later is I've got like 8 windows open, and they open automatically, and we'll talk more about that. But you've got to be able to work between that, the chat service, and looking for your sources for the patron, getting them started. Um, you've got to know how to use the internet, email. You've got to be able to connect to websites. I think that's pretty much standard for all of us, but you'd be surprised. How to use multiple web browsers because, as you know, with technology, things sometimes don't work. So have your backup browser. I use Firefox, but have Chrome and Internet Explorer as well in case things don't work. Um, you know, Basic technologies that the user may not have. Or they might be limited by. Again, talk about that person that's, say, in rural Alabama for us. Are they going to be able to have great internet service? So think about things like that. Again, you've got to know the chat system you're using in and out, so spend some time with it. You can't break it, I promise. But make sure it's set up so it works for your library specifically. Again, how to connect and chat. How can you send documents? Does the chat software allow for you to send documents through the chat service, or are you going to have to email it later? You've got to know those skills. Also, co-browsing. With co-browsing, you can push pages, you can share your screen. Again, is that going to work for the person in rural Alabama who has limited bandwidth? Are they going to understand that? How to save files, how to transfer files, what the common file formats are for computers. Again, is there limitations on the space for the email because sometimes you need to send a large file. And then also there's huge toolbars and extensions. I don't go into that, but there's amazing toolbars and extensions that you can use when you're doing your searching that might be helpful. This is an area I need to work on. I just haven't had time to explore, Firefox extensions, and I know there's a ton out there that would be helpful. Sometimes, like with genealogy and different things like that, you're going to have to know how to scan and send print materials. So that's some technical skills to be aware of. All right, my screen is stalling again. So some of the communication skills. Um, Hopefully this will come up in a second. But some of the communication skills, and to me, along with the technical, this is really important. You've got to be approachable, and you've got to understand that you need to keep learning. And that's what I said in the beginning. I've done this for a while, but I still feel like I, need to keep learning and still need to work on and practice my skills. Um, so you've got to continue learning the technical communications and reference skills. You've got to continue that. I think that's a lifelong thing with librarians. We're always going to continue to learn. Um, so also, when to use your reference interview skills. You don't want to jump right in the beginning. You want to make the person feel comfortable first of all. So you have to know when to use those skills. You've got to be able to empathize with your user just like you would in person. And also you've got to be able to understand kind of the social limitations of the internet. You've got to be able to explain library and research processes without trying, library jargon so much. Have you searched the catalog, comma, that's where, it's a database, or probably not use the word database, but it's a listing of all of our books. You've got to be able to go back and forth with the terminology. And you've got to be able to be professional in this setting, in this library space on the web. You've got to, let me see if I can click this slide. It's okay. There we go. Also, um, it with not having that person in front of you, it's hard to assess who they are, where they're coming from, and you've got to be able to provide information without making value judgments. You've got to maintain that professional objectivity. So if somebody's asking about, say, religion or sex or politics, you've got to be objective and provide the information that they need. Again, if they're asking for medical or legal, we always have that caveat where we state we're not a medical or legal professional. You want to state that in the chat because you would state that in person, but in chat sometimes you forget. So you need to be objective, maintain professional objectivity while still being warm and caring. Um, you've got to be able to read carefully and quickly. You've got to show the user that you are listening. Um, and also, how and why to be there. How to avoid silence. Like I said, my students, one of the biggest things was don't leave me hanging. So as you're doing your chat, scripting will help with that. You can type in, I'm searching, I'm still here, I'm still searching, just to check back in because all they see is silence on the screen. Whereas if you were in person, they'd have you in front of you. um, and then also, it's a judgment call when to teach or instruct during a virtual reference transaction. I mean, if they're looking for a phone number, it's not so much that you're probably going to give them the phone number. You may not teach them how to find the phone number. But if they're looking for information on autism, if there's time, again, you'd assess in the beginning how much time the user has. If there's time, you might teach them how to find autism resources so they can continue their research when you have finished. Again, when to follow up as far as within the chat. If it's something that's not your expertise, when to refer them to somebody else, or what I tell my students is when to table it. If you've gotten to a certain point and it's something you can't answer quickly, within 10, 15 minutes or so, it's perfectly okay to table it and tell them how you will follow up. Maybe it's via email. Maybe it's via an expert in your department. Maybe there's somebody in Florida that's an expert on genealogy. Maybe it's one of those type questions. So that's, knowing how and when to do that is a great communication skill. Okay, my slides are, of course, not cooperating. Let me see, try it again. Okay, reference skills. This is where I feel like we mostly have it made because this is what we do. This is our calling. We've got great reference skills. But again, you could always practice these. I'm always learning new things. I'm always learning new resources. So don't ever stop learning. But, again, reference skills kind of tie in with communication. None of these three different types of skills are isolated. How to maintain this welcoming and enthusiastic reference attitude through this text-based communication. It's very important that you do that. Again, how to apply your library's policies during this chat. For instance, maybe you're not allowed to send full text documents to just anybody. Or maybe they need to come in, to put the book on hold. Or maybe you can put it on hold for them. So you've got to know what your library does. Of course, we've got to know which encyclopedias, almanacs, what standard reference works that we have in our library in print and or electronic format. So much is electronic today, but there's still those key resources that are a tremendous cost if we get the electronic version. So sometimes we have it in print, or sometimes it's available electronically and it's free. And like I said, that next point just kind of talks about that. Again, how to conduct good reference interviews. Role play with each other. Sometimes people's skills get rusty. You've got to be able to analyze reference questions because patrons don't always ask you what they mean to ask you. And again, the organization and accessibility of these print and electronic formats. Because sometimes you will have people ask you questions, and they may be from Alabama, they're not in Florida. So what do they have access to? What can you help them with for free? Or what can you help them with at their library, their closest library? Again, we've got to evaluate information resources for scope, level, and format for that user. We've got to have great search strategies. We've got to know Boolean. We've got to know which licensed databases we have and what web search engines. And then know when to use the advanced search options. Again, that'll depend on the user that you're chatting with. And of course, not everything's on the web. Some things are buried deeply. Some things you have to pay for. And then again, how to use advanced searches in major web search engines, not just Google. There's other ones out there, and we know that. So those are things to keep in mind. Again, there's free web resource tools, but again, there are some limitations for those. They only have limited resources sometimes, or you get to a certain point and they want you to pay for them. Also thinking critically about information sources, when to evaluate, when to teach your user how to evaluate, when to mention that's a skill to have. Again, the fee or licensed databases that your patron may or may not have access to. When maybe you should search your local holdings. Again, that helps if you can determine where your customer is coming from. If you're at a college library that requires students to, or a public library that requires students to enter their barcode to chat, then you know where they're coming from. A lot of places you don't know. They could be coming from anywhere. And again, that option of when to refer them is very important. Okay, so some of the activities that can promote your skills. There are free, so if you feel like some of these skills that you're lacking or you could do better in, and like I said, I still feel like I could practice. I feel like I could be a better typist. I'm pretty fast, but I definitely could do better. So there's some free sites on the internet. One of the things I make my students do, I call it sudden death, and we actually role play. I give them 5 different questions and they copy them down, and whichever chat room they end up, that's the question they take. And they actually role play for 10 minutes, and we've got a timer that counts down. And so, and for them, I am looking for an answer and teaching if possible, instruction if possible, within the interaction, but I'm also looking for the process. So just the process of doing the chat is important as well. Some of the things you can do is you can do the role playing with each other and then review the chat and the transcripts. Just get out a red pen and play with it. I've also got a forum I want to share with you. Again, practice multitasking. Practice just going, chat with another one of your librarian colleagues and just practice going back and forth between the windows. Again, get in there and play with that chat software that you have. Again, like I said, I need to practice on this area. Look at investigating useful browser extensions. Practice the process for good reference interviewing, the 4 R's, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. View database tutorials. There are a ton out there, and you don't always realize all the options in the databases, and that can streamline the time that you spend with your patrons. Attend webinars. So you guys are here today, so hopefully you'll get some good tips from this that you can pass on to your colleagues. I try to do as many webinars as I can. I just don't have time to find everything on my own. Also, participate in discussion lists. I know that they're old school, but believe me, they are so valuable. Also, blogs. There's a lot of virtual reference librarian blogs out there. Make sure you know your reference policy, what you can and can't do with your resources. Again, practice analyzing reference questions and developing search strategies. If you look at, I think it's Quora, Quora, that's a site where people ask all these crazy questions. You can just take some of those or look at a news bulletin and take some of those questions and play with them and take them apart and role play with those questions. That's what I do with my students. I just give them questions that I've actually gotten as a reference librarian, or things I'm interested in the news. I put those in and they practice with them. They practice taking them apart, trying to figure out what the person is actually asking. And like I said, there's also tutorials for keyword and Boolean searching if you're not familiar with that. And that comes into play more with library databases as opposed to searching Google. So hopefully, so this is just a slide. We're not going to do this, I promise. But this is kind of what I do with my students. That depending on how large the class is, it might be one-on-one, one librarian, one customer. I provide a question and set the timer. The first time they really freak out, which is kind of fun to watch. But as they go through the semester, they get better and better at it. And that's why I said practice is really key. So the things that I say you need to focus on is what has the patron told you? Who are they? Where are they coming from? And how can you get that information without being kind of creepy? Like, where are you? You don't just want to come out and ask them that. Maybe you want to ask, so what is your closest library? So how much time do you have today? I want to make sure that, I fully answer your question. Those are some of the things you can ask to kind of get to that. Again, reassuring them that the question is great throughout the chat because they do have that anxiety and frustration of using the internet. And the other thing is, they could have just Googled it, but they chose to come to your chat. So you want to make sure this is a good interaction. No pressure, right? You want to make sure that this is a good interaction and that they have a successful chat uh, transaction with you. And then, like I said, um, something missing in the patron's question? What are they really asking? And so this is just kind of something I do with my students to kind of make them go through that role playing process. And it's something you can do with your colleagues. The other thing you can do is you can visit another virtual reference service. I have my students do that, and they actually evaluate the librarian. They ask a real question. I know a couple of my students have done Florida. I think there's a consortium that they've done in Florida, and they've asked Florida questions. Um, the heart, to me, absolutely the heart of any transaction in a library is the reference interview. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. And so what do we mean by the reference interview? In case you didn't already know, and I know that you guys know, but sometimes it's just really good to see a definition. So it's just that interpersonal communication that occurs between a librarian and a user to determine what they specifically need, which often, as we know, turns out to be a completely different question than the first question that they ask you. And of course, it can occur over the telephone, electronic, or it can be, of course, like we are doing now with virtual reference, it can be through chat. A really good reference librarian will make the person feel comfortable. They can initiate conversation if somebody's hesitant or has that library anxiety that we're talking about. So some of the best practices of a reference interview, and this is independent of the medium that you use, chat, email, whatever it might be. Be approachable or welcoming. Show interest. Listen. Like I've said, that's one of the things that my students say the most is listen to the question. Clarify by, paraphrasing the user's questions. Ask open-ended, closed-ended questions as needed. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Formulate a search strategy and share it with the user. Don't just do the search for them. Show them how to search, because those are skills that they can take with them and they can keep searching, and that helps them to become a lifelong learner. Follow up on how you're doing with them. One of the things my students said is as you're chatting, give them something to chew on. In other words, give them a source to look at while you're searching so that they can decide if they need more information or if you're on the right track, but they've got something to do while you're searching. And then make sure you close the interview. Don't leave them hanging. Let them know that you've completed the transaction or you're waiting on them for more information. Of course, don't assume. Don't assume that that college student knows all the technology or that, snowbird that you get in Florida doesn't know anything. Don't assume anything about people's skills. And again, who are our users? It really defies generalization. We have no idea, and especially in digital reference, you don't know. But just don't make assumptions about what people know, and I think as librarians, we're pretty good at that. Be a skeptic. Again, don't take questions at face value. If somebody says, I need information on China, it could be their dinner set that they got from their wedding, or it could be trade in China or communism. Don't take the question at face value, and I also think that we're pretty good at doing that as well. And again, it's important to identify the scope of the project they're working on. If you have a college student, that 10-page paper is very different than that doctorate level paper, right? So keep in mind the scope of the project. So there are tons of articles about the reference interview. But as I was going through my career, I felt like I needed more practice on the reference interview. And David Tykeson, I hope I'm not bungling his name, has a class called Reference Interview 101. And it's just back to the basics. Again, it's independent of the medium that you're using. But he talks about the 4 R's of the reference interview. And I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the Karate Kid, either the original or the one that they redid. But to me, this is kind of like the wax on, wax off of the reference interview. He's come up with this mnemonic to help you kind of remember. And to me, it's so much simpler than remembering a list of 10 things to do. So he calls this the 4 R's of the reference interview. So these are the 4 R's. The first thing, and it's a cycle. You want to reassure your users. Their question is important. You want to respond. You want to have time to reflect, and then you want to repeat the process. So these are the 4 R's of the reference interview. And to me, this just simplifies it, and it puts focus on the most important parts of what we're trying to do. So the first part, and there's a lot of text here, but I wanted you to have the slides with a lot of text so you could remember and you could have something to look back at. So the first part is to reassure the user. Again, they came to this chat service when they could have Googled. But there is sometimes people don't, there's just this huge psychological barrier to asking for help, right? So this is their first step. And so we want to encourage them and let them know that their question is valued. So some of the things you can say are, yes, I can help you, or that's a great question, or you've come to the right place, I'm sure we can find something for you. You want to reassure them that their question is important. Oops, went too far. Okay, the second thing, of course, you want to do is respond. Once we've reassured them that they can get help, we want to use your reference skills, again, to find out what the real question is. And you can do that through open-ended questions and closed-ended questions, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. And this is the heart of the reference interview, and it's the part that takes the most time, is trying to figure out what they're really asking. Same thing in person. It just takes a while to figure out what they're really asking. And sometimes what they end up going with is, like I've told you before, completely different than what they started with. So how do you ask questions? How do you get to what the real question is? So some of the things you can do, like I said, we've talked about this a little bit, is you want to begin that dialogue. And we don't just answer that question. We create this relationship with the patron. We make them feel comfortable about asking questions. And as I said before, if we make them comfortable about asking questions, they're going to return. To begin a dialogue, you want to make sure that that you've got the right question. In this example, the student asked about periodicals when really she wanted articles on genetic and engineering, and she knew she could find the articles, but she just didn't know specifically how to do that. So several types of questions can help you negotiate this reference interview, this reference question. And there's different kinds of questions you can ask. There's open-ended questions, and these are not yes or no. These will help you kind of make the patron basically talk more. They will gather more information from the patron, and some good questions to ask are, where have you looked so far? What kind of material do you expect to find on this topic? How much material would you like to find on this topic? Could you tell me more about that? That's really interesting. Those are the kind of things you can do to make it, to get you more information. Kind of like when you talk to your kids, or at least when I would talk to my kids and say, how was your day at school? And they'd say, good. that wasn't real helpful. And I'd say, what was your favorite part about today? And then that was a more open-ended question. So you get the idea. You're kind of trying to prompt the person to give you a little bit more information. However, sometimes you need a closed-ended questions. For instance, have you looked in the library catalog? Do you want books or articles? Is this for personal use or is this for a paper? Yes or no questions. Do you want current or historical information? We do this in person. It's just transferring it to more of a digital environment. And near the end, you want to be sure that the patron has what they need. Is this on the right track? Is this what you need? They can answer yes or no. And also, the most important thing is I kind of counsel my students on is don't just use the word okay. Type a sentence. Don't say, okay, you got it. You want to make sure that, you want to be quick, but you want to be polite. Saying okay, or no problem sometimes doesn't connotate that, it's not a problem for you to help them. So I have to kind of tell them about that. So some of the things you also want to do is make sure that the questions are neutral in tone. So for instance, you might ask, how do you plan to use that information? That's a great question, as opposed to, what do you need that for? It's like, why do you need that? That's just kind of aggressive, if that makes sense. And it's just amazing the difference in terminology. Uh, would you tell me more about your topic? Sounds so much better. Can you tell me about your topic? So again, keep in mind some of the neutral terminology that you're using when you talk to your patrons. And then the third part of the 4 R's is you want to reflect. So after you've asked some of these open and closed-ended questions and you've gotten some information back from your patron, you want to reflect it, and then you want to summarize what they've said. So if I understand you correctly, you're looking for, and it's easier to do this in a virtual environment. It's a little bit easier to do this in a virtual environment as opposed to in person, because you can kind of cut through that. But in a virtual environment, you can scroll back up in the text and see what you need to look at, and it's okay to do that. It makes sense because you just have the type in front of you as opposed to talking to somebody. It's not awkward in that respect. And then you want to repeat the process. So as you go through this, as you restate the question, so if I understand you correctly, you're looking for X, and that also sometimes prompts the user to say, yes, that's right, or, oh, by the way, I needed X, Y, and Z. So again, you may have to repeat the process of asking those open and closed-ended questions again. So again, it's kind of a cycle. It's kind of a process. And when I talk to my students and teach them, I said, we're learning the process. Yes, the answer is important, but the process and the relationship is even more important. And again, these techniques are independent. My students have said that independent of the type of, whether it's in person or virtual, they have told me that just the practice in the digital environment has also improved their in-person skills, which is fantastic. So just to kind of give you an example, we don't have time to do a virtual chat. I don't have time to do sudden death with you, although I would love to. Again, technology being what it is, I'm not sure how successful we would be at coming back from that. But this is just a sample dialogue, and I just want to kind of walk you through. This doesn't go through to the point of teaching the patron, but it just kind of walks you through the process that I'm talking about. So, of course, you have a greeting. You have a friendly greeting, and the patron says, yes, I need some statistics, which is huge, right? And so she asks an open-ended question. What kind of statistics are you looking for? I need business statistics, which is still pretty huge. And so she says, we have a lot of data on statistics. Again, that reassures the patron that it's not a dumb question and that we have resources. Is there any specific topic that you need? So again, she asks another open-ended question. And the person finally says, I want import-export data for Korea and the United States. And again, this is still a huge topic, but we're getting there, right? So, continue. She says, I can help you find that. Again, see how there's a cycle. She repeats the reassurance. Do you have a specific product? Automobiles. Again, specific details. So that's kind of a closed-ended question. Do you want statistics? So, and this is where, you're kind of reflecting and you're restating the question. So you want to find statistics on the importing and exporting of automobiles between Korea and the United States. Yes, that's it. But again, still, you might want to go a little bit further because what time period? I mean, that could be huge. So then she asks another closed-ended question, current or historical data? I want the last 5 years. And she says, I know just where to begin with that. And if you were online, you might say, let's start with business source complete if they had access to that, or let's start with maybe census, or depending on what sources are available to them. So I just wanted to give you a quick example of kind of the process. And again, this is independent of the medium. So how can scripting help? And I have a scripting file. Um, if you are not a great typist, you can have a Word document, or depending on your chat software, you can have scripts built in, because you're always going to greet them, you're always going to close, they're always going to have to wait while you're searching, right? So those are some things that you can have predetermined. One of the ones I have is hello X, and then I just put the person's name in there. When you are doing digital reference, it's very important to use the person's name if it's available, and use your name as well. That makes that connection. So again, some of the things I ask are, how much time do you have today? Are you again, as you get towards the end, are you satisfied with what we found so far? Are you able to access the university's library's resources? That helps you not waste your time and the patron's time if they're not a university student. If you do that, be sure to say, don't worry if you're not, I can still help you, because sometimes they'll disconnect right away. And again, knowing your policies is key, because if they are not a student and the policy says that you can't help them, then that's you'll have to figure out a different way to help them with free resources, that kind of thing. But scripting can definitely help. And depending on your library and your policies, there's a couple of scripts, and then you just copy and paste them in, or you have it built into your chat software. The only warning I would say is to make sure it's not too robotic, because sometimes if you use too many scripts, it can sound more like a robot than a person. And again, that's another reason to use somebody's name. So what I want to focus now on is picking the right resources. We are librarians. We know what resources we have for our libraries. But sometimes, again, you get that patron that's not from your library. They can't use your subscription resources, so you want to focus on some free resources. In Alabama, we have a virtual library, state library, that's free to any citizen in Alabama, paid for by the state legislature. I believe Florida, and please forgive me if I'm wrong, but Florida, it's sponsored by the lottery. Tell me if I'm wrong. But there are state libraries that people can use for free. There's this discovery services. I think when I looked at your Florida library page, it was a one search blank that you could search. So there's things you can do with that. Knowing those resources can help save you some time, because you're searching across many resources at once. Google Scholar is particularly helpful if you don't have a lot of those really high cost, high end databases. Sometimes you can find things through Google Scholar. I want to talk to you a little bit about deep web searching, and then advanced search for Google. So I'm going to show you this first, and then I'm gonna go online, and hopefully this will work out. I know I'm taking a chance here with technology, but I just want to talk to you a little bit about some of the sources that you can use. So one of the things that I do when I'm doing digital reference is I have my browser automatically open all of these windows. And if you don't know how to do that, there's a link down here on the bottom of the slide. But what this does is this is a way to kind of search efficiently, because you've got open, I've got a couple extra things open because I want to show you some things, but you've got open the things that you're most likely going to use the most to help your patrons. So what I've got here is I've got, of course, the Florida Electronic Library. I think everybody's coming from Florida, but you may also have, say, your libraries, if you're a college library or special library, maybe you've got a discovery service, you might have that open, so you can go ahead and start searching. I've got the frequently asked questions from the Internet Public Library. And there, we typically get a lot of the same questions over and over again. I know that you do. And so they've got, it's not updated, but they've got some places to start that are fantastic. I don't know if you guys, I'm sure you're aware, but just in case you're not, there's a Google Advanced Search. There's Google Scholar. There's also a resource that Naomi Gold and a couple other people have put together. It's called Databases for the Destitute, and it's arranged by subject area, which is a fantastic place to look. There's also a Google cheat sheet that I want to make you aware of. Of course, in Google is a fantastic place to start. Most of our people do. But one of the things in Google that you can do is you can actually, in the top of the search bar, copy the URL and it will include all of your search options that you have. And the person can, you can copy that into your chat and the person can click on it and it will do a Google search and show them the terms that you used. And my students have found this um, particularly helpful for showing people how to search. Also, LibGuides. There is a search for all the LibGuides out there. There's an academic index search that's fantastic. It searches across a bunch of different search engines at once. And then I always have up YouTube because sometimes people want to know how to do something. We get a lot of questions about, well, how do I do something in Word? How do I, how can I look at my car? What does this gauge mean? You can find them a how-to video. So those are some of the things that I have open. So I'm going to try and share my screen and just go through a couple of the things here that I'm talking about. So give me just a second. Okay, so as I said, again, you'd want to have, say, your discovery service. Right here I've got the Florida Electronic Library. I may have open the Alabama Virtual Library since I'm from Alabama, and those are things I can get to. At my library, I work for a specialized military library. We've got, again, kind of a discovery service that doesn't search every single thing we have, but it's a good start, so I might do that. People like to just get started right away. And again, this is something that you can have open. You know your resources for your library. If you don't, I don't know all of mine because we're constantly getting new things. So I just constantly need to teach myself what we've got. The next thing I'll talk to you about is actually, again, this is not maintained, but as far as public library questions, I think it's just fantastic. Hopefully you've visited this before. Let me scroll down and just kind of show you. There are a couple of subjects here. You get the question about what's the best-selling book of all time? Is it the Bible? So there's just a bunch of different questions here. They're fantastic that can kind of get people started. How can I find business article for my college paper? And they refer to a lot of free resources. So if you don't have those high-end databases, people want company information or stock information. They want questions about history or military trivia, different things like that. So again, it's just a really great place to get started. You can find one or two sites. You could even email the person this site here, and they can look at some of these sites to get started while you're searching other resources. But it's just really broken down really nicely for some of those questions that we kind of always get. I think it's just a fantastic site. Even baby names, or why is this sky blue, subjects. So it's just kind of a great place to get started for a lot of those questions we get all the time, a lot of public library questions. Hopefully you'll find that helpful. As far as Google, one of the things I wanted to show you, I'm going to search for autism, and Of course, we're going to get a bazillion things. Um, with Google, of course, you can say what kind of resources you want by changing the type of site, site colon period edu. So if we just want educational sites. But what you can do is up here in the toolbar, you can copy that address and you can paste that into the chat, like I said, and that will put in the search here in Google so they can see your search and then they can start looking through some of the sources while you're looking for other sources. So of course Google has all kinds of tips and tricks. If I'm going to go to the next tab here, this is a Google guide. I'm not going to open this cheat sheet, but there's a 2-page cheat sheet. Of course, Google has evolved over time, but these are just some really quick things that you can do to help you search faster. My favorite thing is this Google Advanced Search right here. This is not having to know all the tips and tricks and keywords. But what I love about it, and they used to have it on the main screen, but they've taken it away. So you actually have to Google Advanced Search for it to come up. Because what I like about it is you don't have to know Boolean, your patrons don't have to know Boolean, but it gives you examples over here on the far right side. You can narrow it by language, region, last updated. And then the thing that I like probably the most is, let's see, where is it? There's a document type somewhere down here. I thought file type right here. So if you know that you're looking for a paper or an article, you can say that you want PDF. Okay, you can say PDF. You want things that are PDF, and let's say if you want things on autism, and let's say if you don't want things on drugs, you don't want autism drugs or anything like that, or vaccinations, you can say that you don't things on that, because there's a lot of people that talk about autism vaccination. Let's see if I can spell. Let me just try drugs. Okay, again, and you can do a search on that. Let's do that very quickly. So you can click on advanced search. And again, once you do your advanced search, you can copy everything that's up here in this URL and you can send that to your patron and it's going to put the search that you did in the toolbar. And so that kind of teaches them a little bit about how to search. Of course, Google Scholar, I just want to show you something very quickly. You can search Google Scholar very quickly. It's going to work for you. It's going to find documents and things. But what a lot of people don't know is here under Settings, clicking on Settings, and if you click on Library Links, you can actually add your library. So if I do University of Florida, and people love searching Google. They love that interface. They don't always love our discovery services. So I can actually search for University of Florida. And let's see. Okay, so here's University of Florida. So I'm going to add it in. And you can add up, I think you can add up to 5. And then what you want to do is make sure and save it. And it's searching OCLC plus it's searching University of Florida. So if there's something that comes up full text, you have a discovery service at University of Florida, it'll list that along with OCLC and what other libraries you're thinking of. So if you have a patron's library, if they're not with your library, they're not in Florida, you can use Google Scholar to help them search their library. And again, up here at the top where it has, if you start to do a search, you can actually copy that link and it will still keep their libraries that you've searched in there. So it's kind of a neat source. The next source, just really quickly, is the databases for the destitute. And like I said, a lot of libraries, their budgets are dwindling. And so you need to find alternate ways to find information for your patrons that they can access We just don't have the money that we used to, and the prices of the databases, to me, are staggering. And our patrons have trouble searching them. So this is just a fantastic source. I'm just going to click on the A through B to kind of give you an idea. So again, this is done by subject area. So it's got some free encyclopedias and dictionaries, and it's got just some great resources to kind of get you started. So the next thing I'm going to talk about very quickly is this concept of the deep web. And I know that Naomi has done a presentation on this for you guys for Swiftland, but I just want to talk about the concept very quickly. It's kind of a technique because when you're looking at the web, I think there's only like percent. Hopefully this will load quickly. There's a really good image here. So when you're searching Google, it's only a really small percentage of the web that you're looking at because the actual web is about 4,000 to 5,000 times larger. So think about all the information that we're missing. There are things, of course, in these subscription databases that it doesn't go into. There are things that are not HTML, they're PDF, so unless you specify PDF, you're not going to find it. Sometimes things are too big to be indexed. There's all kinds of different limitations. And a lot of times, of course, things that are in databases, there's articles that are written by scholars. They're more likely to be validated. They're more focused. They're more credible, of course. So we're missing some of those things. So one of the things that the deep web does is it supplements some of those subscription databases. It meets a variety of patrons with high quality resources, and it can also teach the patron, the deep web concept can teach the patron how to search the web more effectively. So here's a couple of deep web resources. If you Google deep web and search engine, you'll come across a bunch of them. But what I want to show you is kind of this process for searching directly. So here's an example. It's kind of a three-step process. So for instance, let's say if you're looking quickly, you're chatting with somebody online and you're looking quickly for resources, and they have this topic of history, and you're trying to get them started. And let's say they want history statistics. And so what you're going to do is you have a broad subject area, like history. You type in a type of information. Say you want documents, image statistics, and then you're going to type in what we call a deep web designator, like database, search engine, archive, libguide, video. Those are kind of deep web terms, and they'll find sources for you. So for instance, this is an example of that you might do architecture, images, databases. One of the terms that they did was corn, Alabama databases. And you can get, what they got was the Environmental Working Group's 2011 Farm Subsidy Database, which you would not have found if you just searched for corn. So that's kind of the concept of searching the deep web. So if somebody were doing something on autism, you could go to Google. I'm going to do that very, very quickly. If you go to Google, let's say if you do autism statistics database. Here's the National Database for Autism Research. And if I just search for autism, it may not have been super helpful. So again, these things are on the web, but they're buried deeply down in these databases. And so what you need to do is put in these terms so you can kind of get to that top level of the deep web, and then you can explore. As I said, there are deep web search engines. One of my favorites is called Academic Index, and you can have it search all of these sources at once. And a lot of it will take you to free resources. Some of it will be free resources that list sources you have to pay for. But again, a lot of times when you're doing digital reference, you're trying to get your user started. You're trying to refine that question. You're trying to give them sources. So that's one of the things you can do. Another one I like is there is actually a search engine for libguides. And so what better place to go then to a place where librarians have created guides. Now, I could also go to Google and type autism libguide, and that would be a deep web search, but I can also type it here in this search, and it's going to find me libguides that other librarians have produced. And so sometimes this is a great place to get started for, again, helping our users get started. You can give them a couple of sources to look at while you're continuing to answer their full question. And then lastly, just focusing on you YouTube. So I have, if we've got time, Erin, do we have time or do we need to wrap it up?
You have time.
Okay, so what I'd like you guys to do, and I will put this, I'll type this in the chat window because I know it's sometimes easier to click on. Well, not in my chat window, but we'll see. Erin, I don't know if you can type it faster than me because my chat window will not let me type. It's still working on the H. But what I'd like to do, and I can share my screen if that's easier. But what I've done is I've given you on this link, there is a sample chat with actually one of my students, and then I've got the form beside it. And so what I'd like you guys to do is to actually practice evaluating a chat. So I'm going to share my screen so you can kind of see what it looks like. Give me just a second, and then we'll come back and you can, if you, I know you guys can't talk because you're muted, but if you would just type in the chat window kind of what you thought. So give me just a second. I'll share my screen so you can kind of see what that looks like. So there's the actual form that's on the web, if you wanted to get back to that. But here sense you can come back to this if you don't want to do it today or you don't feel like you have time today. And again, I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity to have an activity. I know it's hard to do in this kind of environment, but I just wanted to give you a chance to practice. You don't have to do it now, but you've got the link. You can go back and look at it and kind of practice the process. You can see an actual chat. I can give you other chats if you would like to practice. I've got a million transcripts, so just let me know. Did anybody actually? It's okay if you didn't. I understand we have limited time. Technology doesn't always work, but if you would post in the chat box if you actually did have a chance to do it, I'd be interested to know your opinion. Okay, so the site's really slow, looks like. Okay, well, that's okay. Consider it your homework, and you can always email me and tell me how it went. I'd be happy to respond to your email and follow up like a good digital reference librarian. Um, but please, take a chance and look at it and see if it's something you think you would find helpful. Like I said, practice is the center of all of this. Practice and refining your skills and to keep learning. Use that scripting. So these are some words of kind of final words of advice. Again, use scripting where you can. Be proficient at what your university has, and then have that strategy, with the open windows so you can quickly search and move between things. Hopefully, you can have your tabs set up that way. Take advantage of those deep web terms, libguides plus autism, or database plus Civil War. That's going to give you some of those sources that Google just can't find because they're so huge and they've got a wealth of resources behind that database and it's just not searching them. Have that balance between pay and free resources. Databases costs are just going up. I think we're going to have to continue to focus on some of the free resources. Use some of those advanced shortcuts, the Google Advanced Search and Google Scholar, because people really appreciate that interface over a library's interface. They just don't get it. And sometimes, I do searches and it doesn't work for me either. So sometimes that Google interface is great for your patron, and they can do that for free. Even if the results aren't free, they can still search for free. Evaluate your chats. See how you're doing. Continue to learn. Get out those chat transcripts, role play. Get those chat transcripts and evaluate them and see where you need to, what area needs the most work. Maybe it's the instruction. Maybe it's the, knowing when to table it or refer it to somebody else, that kind of thing. Um, and then, like I said, role play. The practice is the very best. Even if you don't get an answer, just practicing the process of making the person feel comfortable. Those are all, I'm not sure why my screen just went to that. Those are all things that can be super helpful. And then there is a fantastic virtual reference bibliography at Rutgers. Every single article that I think has ever come out, they have a database for, and it's called the Virtual Reference Bibliography, and the link is there. So those are things that would be fantastic to do. If there's any way I can help you, if you would like me to send you some transcripts from my students so you can practice. But like I said, it's even better if you role play with other librarians and just take that time to practice with each other. Are there any questions? Again, I think you've got my email if you need it. If you need to email me, if not, Aaron's got it. He's going to send you a PDF of everything. I'm so sorry the technology kind of cut in and out on us. That's the nature of trying to do, these webinars. Sometimes more effective than others. But hopefully you were able to get something out of it, maybe something you didn't already know, or a strategy, or something to follow up on later when you're back at work. Hopefully this has been something that is helpful to your career, and I'm available. Please let me know whatever I can do to help you out. This is my passion. I want our patrons to use us wherever they are. And I think that digital reference is one of the ways that we can enhance our services, besides just being in person. So thank you very much. I know Erin may want to direct any questions that people have. Does anybody have any questions?
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Rollins, for a wonderful webinar. Some information, a sneak peek of what is coming up. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, be sure to join us for DigiRef Academy Religion, It's a Question of Faith, which will take place on Tuesday, January 10th, 2017, also by our very own Dr. Rollins, and she'll go over questions and resources for questions you may receive about religion. Also, please join us for launching an idea from concept to crowdfunding, building a brand on December 15th. Great to hear it, Beth. Also, when opportunity knocks, understanding library culture and your part in it, which will take place on Friday, December 16th. We encourage you to look at the upcoming webinars and workshops in months ahead and hope you are all able to join us for future training opportunities. As always, please feel free to keep checking the Swiftland CE calendar on the Swiftland website, the Florida statewide training calendar, our Swiftland Facebook page, our message from the Swiftland Twitter, or look for your email on the Florida Library listserv. Thank you for attending and have a terrific weekend.